Hello everyone! In today's video, I'm going to be showcasing the complete build process of this Pro Touring style 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS. The goal for this build was to be a simple and straightforward project, utilizing an FFR SC1 chassis and a Revell 1/24 scale model kit. I also wanted to use this car as a test bed for some new parts, so I decided not to include an interior with this car to simplify the build, allow much more room for electronics, and make maintenance and swapping parts much easier. Although I kept this build basic and focused on building a car that will be a driver and didn't want to invest a ton of time with this body, I still made a few simple modifications to help make this car look more unique and give it a Pro Touring style look. The finished car turned out great, and I'm really excited to showcase this project. So with all that said, let's get started. The build started with this Revell 70 Chevelle model kit that I've had in my collection for a little while now. This is a 3-in-1 kit, meaning it has extra optional parts that allow you to build this car one of 3 ways, or you can mix and match certain parts. All the parts included with this kit look very nice, and it's great to see all of the additional parts that are included. Although most of them will go unused since I only need the body, all of the additional parts will be great to have on hand for a future build or for a diorama. One thing I wish this kit would have included was black stripes. I originally wanted to paint the body yellow with black stripes, but I ended up changing plans and still ended up with something I'm really happy with. Here's a closer look at all the parts that are included. Although the body looks nice right out of the box, I wanted to do a little work to it in a few spots, as well as make a few modifications to allow it to fit onto the chassis. As you can see, the inner fender and firewall sections are molded as a part of the body and will need to be removed. I marked where I wanted to make the cut and will later use a hot knife to remove these sections. I also marked any mold lines left from the manufacturing process that I'll want to sand away. I was careful when removing the chrome parts. Since I won't be painting or rechroming them, I don't want to scrape off any of the chrome that's there. After the chrome parts were off, I then removed the hood, side view mirrors, and a lower piece that goes in the back under the bumper. The final parts that I would need are the clear plastic parts for the front lights and windows. I began test fitting all the parts and did any sanding or trimming necessary to allow everything to fit. I wanted to do a few very basic modifications to the body, the first being to remove the hood pins and the air intake flap towards the back. The hood pins could simply be scraped and sanded away. The hood flap needed some filler along with sanding to be removed. I then sanded away any mold lines or other imperfections on the body, as well as deep into the panel gaps. In addition to that, I also sanded away the Fender SS emblems and the Chevelle emblem on the trunk to give the body a little cleaner look. I also sanded away the very faint panel gaps around the pieces surrounding the headlights. After allowing the filler on the hood time to dry, I sanded it flush and then once again test fit it onto the front. I went ahead and glued this rear piece in place. I'll later sand the transition between these two parts smooth as well. While I waited for the glue to dry, I removed the front inner fender and firewall sections that I marked earlier. Once the glue on the back had fully dried, I sanded the transition between the two parts until it was seamless. I did notice that there were a few spots on both the front and back that needed a little bit of filler, which I applied and then sanded flush. I removed each headlight lens from the parts tree and test fit them into each light housing. They were tricky to get into place due to their small size, but they fit perfectly. The only challenge was making sure they don't get lost before it's time to finish the car. One of the side view mirrors was missing a chunk of plastic from the top. I tried using a little filler to fill this section and then sand it flush, but it's such a thin section that it kept crumbling away, so I just sanded the front section of the mirror to make the missing section seem as small as possible without removing too much material. Once the body was how I wanted, I sanded the entire surface with 600 grit sandpaper to prepare it for primer. With the prep work complete, I was ready to move on to painting. Before applying paint, I started by laying down a few light coats of primer. In hindsight, I should have used white primer, as will become apparent once I begin painting, but all in all, it wasn't a big deal. The primer can help show any imperfections and spots that still need a little more work. Aside from the section where the hood flap was previously still being slightly visible, everything looks great, and after a quick pass with some 600 grit sandpaper, I was ready to apply paint. I decided to paint the hood flat black and the body gloss yellow. This is the first time I've used Valspar paint for a model car body, so it was a bit of a learning experience. The paint goes on very thin and is really prone to running. It's got a thinner consistency than what I'm used to with most spray cans. If I was to do it again, I'd apply the coats much thinner and do about twice as many of these light coats as normal. I think that would really help. With the paint being so thin, the gray primer showed through the paint even after many coats. This had sort of a cool effect that can only really be seen in person, but I ended up needing to apply a lot of paint to get a solid bright yellow. I was still satisfied with the finished result, and if I ever find myself painting another body with this same paint, I think I could do an even better job. I had originally wanted to finish the paint work for this body in a weekend, but since I had to apply so much yellow, I gave it a full week to cure. I then wet sanded the paint and did my best to remove some of the dust that had landed in the paint. For fun, and to add to the custom appearance of this car, I printed some custom decals onto some water slide decal paper and then applied them to the body. To make these, I used an inkjet printer, and the water slide sheet is from the lowest cost pack that I could find, so understandably these decals were not of the quality you would expect from the decals included with a model kit, but they still worked okay. I got some microset and microsole solution to assist with applying these decals. After experimenting some, I found that they needed to have a light coat of clear before applying, otherwise the ink would get rinsed off. The hood decal turned out okay, but since this decal was printed on a transparent sheet, the lettering is far less visible once applied onto the black hood. These decals also seemed quite thick, and it was difficult to get them to lay down smooth. All in all though, the hood decal still turned out looking decent, and the decals I applied onto the fenders looked even better. Once I finished adding the decals, I applied the clear coat. I had previously tested applying this clear coat onto this paint with a scrap piece of styrene to ensure that there would be no bad reaction prior to painting this body. After allowing the clear plenty of time to dry, the finished result turned out really nice and should help seal the decals. Although the clear was looking good at this point, I still went ahead and polished it. There were a few details on the body that I wanted to paint, including the drip rails and the window trim. Although these sections would have been chrome from the factory, I decided to paint them black. I used a little rubbing alcohol to clean the surface, and then carefully masked off each section. I then used an airbrush to apply the paint, being careful not to apply it too thick to avoid the paint getting past the masking. There were still a few spots where the paint did get past, and to remove this paint, I simply used a toothpick to carefully scrape it away. With the body looking how I wanted, I moved on to painting some details on the bumpers. I started by painting the middle section of the rear bumper black, being careful not to paint outside of this section. I decided to use a wash to paint the lower sections of the grille, although after a closer look, it looks like the whole grille on the full-size cars were painted black, though doing it this way does add some detail. I used a Sharpie permanent marker to color a raised section in the middle to easily add just a little more detail. To paint the lights on each bumper, I'm using Tamiya transparent paints, red for the rear and orange for the front turn signals. Nothing really special here, except for the taillights, I scraped the paint off of some raised sections so the chrome is showing. Just like I did with the raised section on the grille, I used a Sharpie to go around this outer edge of the headlight buckets since I thought it would look cool to have the outer edge outlined in black. On the full-size cars, the side marker lights would be amber and red, but since after all the coats of paint and clear, they are not well defined, and I decided not to bother, but I did want to paint the door handles black. I installed each light bucket using some micro crystal clear glue, which dries clear, meaning any excess will not be noticeable. I then used the same glue to secure each lens. This car won't have any kind of detailed engine bay, so I glued the hood into place. After that, I glued both the front and rear bumpers, making sure that they were aligned correctly. Next, I turned my attention to the windows. Since this car will have no interior, I will be cutting a piece of clear plastic for each side window. I decided it would be easiest to remove this section of the window piece that's included with the kit. That way I can mount the windows I'll be making easier and not have to worry about them lining up with the rear quarter windows. I traced the opening onto some paper to use as a stencil before cutting each piece of clear plastic. To prevent the windows from being completely transparent, I applied a heavy amount of Tamiya smoke to each window to give them a heavy tint. I'll be installing the windows during the final assembly of this car. If you've been watching this channel for a while, I'm sure you're well aware of the build process of an FFR SC1 chassis. It all starts with determining the wheelbase and width the chassis needs to be and measuring across the bottom of the body as seen here. With those measurements, I can choose the correct size chassis pieces and print them. The parts looked nice right off the printer, but to improve the appearance even more, I decided to paint the chassis. I started by assembling all the parts, then I sprayed some matte black paint. While the paint on the chassis dried, I moved on to assembling the MA10 axle I'll be using. This axle is unique as the design has been modified to allow it to be printed on a hobby-grade FDM printer. I did some sanding and then painted each half of the housing silver. I also painted the torque arm with some of the paint left over. I think the silver paint turned out looking great. I finished assembling the axle after the paint dried, making sure to take my time and get everything measured and installed correctly. By this time, the paint applied to the chassis was dry and I could install the axle. I started by securing the torque arm to the axle. I then secured each lower trailing arm and the panhard bar. With these parts being prototypes, I didn't have the correct torque arm chassis mount on hand, so I just glued the one that I had into place on the chassis. Like I said before, I really like the silver painted axle and torque arm. I think I might end up painting the panhard bar and trailing arms to match. With the rear suspension together, I moved on to the front suspension, which will be an MC01 assembly. Before mounting the MC01 to the chassis, I first cut the drive shaft to the correct length and installed the N20 motor and gear assembly. With the motor and drive shaft in place, I next mounted the MC01 assembly using a 1.6mm spacer between it and the chassis. With the chassis nearing completion, I decided I wanted to make some custom wheels and tires for this car. Since I'm wanting to go with a Pro Touring look for this build, I wanted to make some wheels that look like something you'd see on a Pro Touring car. I also designed these wheels to be in 2 separate parts and to be able to be printed on a typical FDM 3D printer. The tires will also be 3D printed using PLA plastic rather than the silicone slicks that I've used on previous builds. Once I had a design that I liked, I printed out each piece. I'm putting wider 14mm width wheels in the rear and 11mm width wheels in the front. To remove a lot of the layering, I sanded everything and then applied coats of primer until the surface of the parts looked smooth. After one final pass of sanding, I painted the outer pieces silver and the inner parts gloss black. Although it's a little tedious, the time spent sanding and priming pays off as the surface of these wheels look very smooth. I glued each part using a little bit of super glue. The paint was still just barely tacky, so I used gloves to prevent fingerprints from showing up when pressing. The wheels turned out great, and I was really excited to see how they'd look on the car. With the wheels now put together, I could begin the final assembly of the car. I started by installing the rear wheels to ensure that the width would not be too wide for this body. It was really close to rubbing, but just barely fit. I also quickly mocked up the front wheels just to see how they looked, and I was really pleased already with how this car was turning out. To allow me to install the front wheels, I cut and glued sections of M2 threaded rod to the inside of the bearings. I then positioned the wheel hex mounts out far enough for the wheels to be the correct width, making sure that they were not too wide so that they don't rub against the body. As you can see here, the rear tires were very close to rubbing against the chassis, especially as the suspension moved, so I swapped them out with some slightly narrower tires. The next thing I needed to do was create some body mounts to secure the body to the chassis. This is something you would normally want to do before painting the body, however I've mounted many bodies using this process, so I was confident it would turn out fine and not mess up the paint. I started by creating some L-shaped pieces of styrene that would be glued to the inside of each door, and the bottom would be secured to the chassis using machine screws. This is pretty much the same process I used to secure the 85 Mustang body that I built a while back, but I'm using larger styrene pieces here instead of those 3D printed mounts. I did my best to shape the section that will be glued to the body so that it will fit tight up against it. I marked the location of where each will need to be glued, and I then used some shoe goo to secure each mount to the body. The shoe goo is nice since it starts holding strong right after applying it, but it takes some time to fully cure, so I can test fit the body and make any adjustments until it sits just how I want it. I'll be finishing up the body mounts a little later, but while allowing it plenty of time to dry, I installed the steering servo and steering linkage. After that was in place, I installed all of the remaining electronics, which are the receiver, battery, and ESC. I also needed to use an adapter for the steering servo. Just like with any other build, I got everything wired and plugged into the correct spots, binded the transmitter to the receiver, and did some quick tests. With everything working good, I needed to figure out where on the chassis everything will be mounted. I needed to make sure that I didn't put anything in the sections where the body mounts will go. I used some small pieces of styrene to make a raised section where the receiver will go. I used double-sided tape to secure the ESC to the area on top of the axle and used Velcro to secure the battery to the rear. To finish up, I used zip ties to tidy up the wires and once again did a quick test. By this point, the glue had plenty of time to dry, so I could finish working on the body mounts. I positioned the chassis in place on the body and then marked where I will need to drill the holes. I made the holes on the chassis as large as possible to allow for some minor adjustments to be made. With everything lining up good, I inserted the M1.6 machine screws into the mounts and threaded on some nuts. I glued each nut into place and then removed the screws. The nuts are now permanently attached to the mount and will give the screws something to thread into to secure the body. The body mounts are now complete. I intentionally made them so the body sits low on the chassis, since spacers or washers can always be added to raise the body up some if needed. Part of the reason too that the body is sitting so low is that the suspension is bottoming out. The added weight of the body is just too much, so I decided to install harder springs. It takes a lot of patience and adjustments to get the suspension just right. After installing these new springs, the suspension is now stiffer than what I want, but it'll be okay for now. At some point I'll come back and make further adjustments. At this point, I couldn't resist doing some test driving. Despite the hard plastic tires, this car still handled like it was on rails when driving on these foam mats. On hard surfaces, the car has much less traction and is really fun to slide around, as you'll see later on. Right now though, the car was driving great. The only issue I encountered was some serious wheel rub on the back tires. The rear end is just slightly too wide to fit. Fortunately, I was able to fix this just by carefully removing some material from the body in these areas. With everything looking good as far as driving goes, I was ready to add the finishing touches to the body. First, I installed the windshield and rear window. I once again used some of the clear drying glue that I had used previously. Once that was in place, I installed the side windows that I made earlier. One little detail that I wanted to add was this part that goes in between the rear quarter windows and the door windows. I cut 2 small strips of styrene and colored them black with a Sharpie. I cut them to the correct length and then glued them into place. I then installed each side view mirror, which I painted the same color as the hood. I carefully glued each mirror piece to them and then glued them to the body. Finally, I printed 2 rear tailpipe pieces, which I sanded smooth and then painted silver. I didn't like how far down they were, so I sanded the top part until they sat closer to the body. After that, I glued each to the rear of the chassis. At this point, I was satisfied with the appearance of the car and was ready to do some driving. I'm really pleased with how this car turned out. The look is exactly what I wanted, and this is one of the most fun to drive cars I've currently got. The only thing I forgot to add to the body that I just noticed while editing is a license plate, which I'll be sure to add at some point. The car drives very smooth. The 4,000 RPM motor provides plenty of speed and torque. I do still want to experiment some with the suspension and get that dialed in, and maybe make a few adjustments with the settings on the transmitter and the weight distribution, but beyond that, this car is just how I wanted. As I said before, the car gets a ton of traction on these foam mats, even with hard plastic tires. On hardwood floors, it's a lot of fun since there is minimal traction. Although I do like the oversteer, there is quite a bit of understeer that occurs when going into a turn that I'll probably want to address, especially since I'm wanting to drive this car on harder surfaces. Reducing the negative camber and adjusting weight distribution should help, or also installing higher traction front tires. Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help make more content like this possible, as well as get yourself early and exclusive access to videos and STL files, including some of the parts you've seen in this video, consider becoming a member on Patreon via the link below in the description. Also, if you'd like to build a car like this yourself, I've included some links to the parts used and specifications below in the description. If you have not already, be sure to check out the previous full build video featuring this 1/25th scale 1983 Camaro. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll like that one as well. To conclude this video, I want to showcase some of the awesome builds and projects that have been showcased over at the Make It RC Facebook group. A link to our Facebook page is below in the description. The group is open to anyone interested in any kind of RC creations, as well as model building and 3D printing. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, feel free to join. That is all for this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.